So if we take what I've run through already, we design a city that probably works reasonably well, but it's probably a bit dull. It's something like this street in 1950s suburban America. Dead straight streets, all the buildings the same distance from the street, quite low density perhaps in this case, and it's just not very interesting, but actually it works okay. But if we add some other features to that, we make it more interesting, we actually make a much more interesting place, and if we understand how we can do that, we can then factor that into designing new places, or when we're seeing change in an existing street, we can understand what that impact will be. So at the most basic level, if we just start to move some of these buildings around a bit, that changes the feel of when you look down the street. And we could add some more buildings in to increase the density a bit, and that again would change the feel of the street. It probably actually feels like a more traditional street then, rather than like a housing estate. Or if we go to the next step, that's a little bit of curvature to the road, not too much, not like those big sweepy roads in a housing extension of the 1970s, but just enough to add some interest and richness to that street. Then that curvature starts to make that street just a bit more interesting. And then you can start to look at finishes, maybe planting a few trees on the street. And then you've got a much, much more interesting street. But you might want to look at building bigger buildings there, and that changes the street again. Simply dropping bigger buildings in there changes how that street feels. And we can actually understand that fairly simply if we look at the height to width ratio of the street. So, take this street here. If we change the height to width ratio, it changes the feel of the street. So we've made now quite a narrow, intimate street. If we double the height of the buildings, then we change that height to width ratio and it feels really enclosed and claustrophobic and not particularly nice. But if we change the height to width ratio, we double the width of the street because we've doubled the buildings, well actually we have a fairly similar feel to the street. We then probably have somewhere you can drop a few trees in and it doesn't feel like it's entirely clogged up with trees. But if we keep widening it, eventually you get to something that feels like an urban expressway that just won't work particularly well. And particularly if you have low-rise buildings, you're going to have that problem fairly quickly, that you get to the point that something becomes not very nice on the street because it's so wide, you've probably got 6 lanes of traffic to cross. So that ratio is far more important than what that building looks like. And the next thing that really matters is probably more building focused. And I've been telling you not to think about buildings, but now we're going to have to. And this is a corner. So to explain that, I'm afraid we're going to have to change the models. Right, welcome back. We've changed the model now, and I've got a couple of houses I've made out of some boxes. And every house is the same as pretty much every building in that it has a front. But it also will generally have a back, and the back is usually not very nice. And when you design a place, you should always have the front of the building facing the front of the street. And then the back of the building should face the back of another building, so the bad bit hides the bad bit. But that creates a problem when we get to a corner. Because what happens here? Well, we've got the main front of the building on the main street, but then we have a side facing another street. Now, a side is not as bad as a back. A back will be particularly bad. But it doesn't work great. So how can we deal with that? Well, 60s and 70s, what did they do? Stick a house on a corner, standard pattern house, drop it in there. Funny sized front garden, weird end gardens, you still see the end. It doesn't work very well. The better way to deal with that is say, well, that is also should really have a front there. So what do? We put another front there. And in this case, we've got a main road and a secondary road. So we have a main front and a secondary frontage. And we can try and prop these fronts in, and they actually stay up, which is quite good this time. And there we see a street which works far better because we head down the side street and it's activated to some degree. And we see that in good urban design, in good buildings, in good architecture. And here we've got a pub. This is a really old pub. It's on 2 important streets, so it's got 2 frontages. Or here we've got a modern building on two important streets, and it actually has the entrance right on the corner to show that it's got two frontages. So if we take how the corner works and applies that in a city, we can make the city more interesting. And that matters when we come to this model. If we take this corner building out, well, in fact, in this scenario, you basically can't see the corner building at all when you look down the street. But if we move it a little bit and make the street more interesting, then we can see that corner building. So if we put a more interesting building in there, we then make the whole street more interesting because we create a landmark when we look down the street. In fact, if we start to move some of the buildings around a little bit as well, so that the street just becomes a little bit more fragmented and interesting, then that feature building suddenly becomes a real feature on a really interesting street. And it doesn't matter whether it's modern, as is represented by this 100-year-old lump of brass, or old-fashioned looking like this brand new pastiche model. It still has the similar impact when you look down the street. Simply having a landmark there makes it more interesting. And that's even if we obscure it from a distance so you can only see it down the street rather than over the roofs. That just makes the street more interesting. And once we understand that, we can apply that into places. We can say, well, actually, let's design it right. We can have fairly simple basic buildings, a few more interesting buildings on the corner, and actually we create a really great, interesting place. And frankly, we want to live in places that have character and are interesting. So that's what we need to understand and do.